The dust swallowed the horizon whole, a cruel, red shroud pulled tight across a sky the color of bruised plums. Alara pushed one foot in front of the other, each step an agony that echoed through her very bones. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of fragile hope, was now a tattered, grit-caked shroud, clinging to her emaciated frame. 2 days had passed since she fled the dusty, oppressive town, since she fled the man whose hand she was meant to take, a man with eyes like chipped flint and a laugh that chilled her soul. Thirst clawed at her throat, a fiery phantom, and her vision swam. The sun, a malevolent eye, beat down, draining what little resolve remained. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the sharp pebbles biting into her skin. A low whimper escaped her lips, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. She was alone, utterly and terribly alone, a speck of dying life in a land that cared nothing for human suffering. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over her like a burial shroud. This was it, then, the end of her short, unremarkable life, swallowed by the land she'd sought to escape. A shadow fell over her, not the sun's, but something denser, more substantial. She flinched, not daring to look up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Fear, sharp and immediate, replaced the dull ache of despair. Had they sent someone after her? The very thought was a fresh wave of terror. A rough, calloused hand appeared in her blurred vision, holding a dented canteen. The metal glinted, a beacon in the shimmering heat. She hesitated, her breath catching. Then, a gruff, low voice, surprisingly even, cut through the silence. "Drink." She looked up, her eyes struggling to focus. He was a man of the land, etched by sun and wind, his face weathered, his eyes a startlingly pale blue beneath a broad-brimmed hat. He was tall, lean, with a quiet strength that emanated from him like heat from a stone. An outsider, she knew. Silas. He kept to himself, a shadow on the periphery of the town, trading furs and odd jobs. He was the kind of man the townspeople eyed with suspicion, his silence mistaken for surliness, his solitude for something more sinister. Her gaze darted from the canteen to his face, searching for guile, for malice, but found only a detached kind of pity. Driven by an animalistic thirst, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they closed around the cool metal. She drank, gulping down the water as if it were the elixir of life itself, some of it spilling down her chin, tracing paths through the dust on her throat. It was the purest, most exquisite sensation she had ever known. She did not know, could not know, that a small group of riders had crested the ridge behind them, their eyes sharp, their mouths set. They were the town elder, Josiah Vance, his 2 sons, and the very man Alara had fled. Their faces, already grim, contorted with outrage at the sight. A lone woman, barely clad, taking water from a solitary man in the desolate expanse. To their eyes, it was an undeniable tableau of illicit rendezvous, a scandal unfolding beneath the harsh sun. The water revived her enough to stand, shaky but upright. She looked at Silas, a flicker of something akin to gratitude in her eyes, before the shouts began, tearing through the quiet air like a rusted blade. "Silas Thorne, what devilry is this?" Josiah Vance's voice, usually slow and measured, boomed with righteous fury. The men spurred their horses forward, surrounding them, their faces a mask of judgment. Alara instinctively shrank back, pressing herself against Silas, a fragile moth drawn to a fleeting warmth. Silas, for his part, remained impassive, his gaze meeting Vance's without flinching. "She was dying of thirst," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a simple declaration of fact. "She ran from her marriage, Silas. And you, a man of no family, no ties, you take her in hand, alone in the wilderness." Vance spat, his eyes blazing. "This is an outrage, an affront to decency, to God-fearing folk." The spurned groom, a thick-necked man named Thomas, dismounted, his face purple with rage. "She shamed me, shamed my family, and now she shames us all with this." This common vagrant. He gestured wildly at Silas. A murmur rippled through the small group of riders. The implications were clear, damning. Silas was an outsider, convenient to blame. "There is but one way to cleanse the stain," Vance declared, his voice cutting through the rising tension. His gaze swept from the cowering Alara to the unyielding Silas. "You will marry her, Silas Thorne. You will give her a name, a home, and make this right. Or, by God, we will see you strung up for what you have done out here in the wilds. You have defiled her, man, and you will pay the price." Alara's breath hitched. Marry him? The stranger who had offered her water? The man they despised? Her mind reeled. Silas remained silent, his pale eyes distant, assessing the desperate situation, the odds. He saw the grim determination in Vance's eyes, the malevolence in Thomas's. He saw the rope coiled on one of the saddles. There was no argument, no appeal to reason. This dusty, unforgiving town had rendered its judgment. He was trapped. He simply nodded once, a barely perceptible dip of his head. Alara watched him, a shiver running through her, not of cold, but of a fate utterly beyond her control. Her escape had led her not to freedom, but to a different kind of prison. The marriage was a grim charade. It took place in the town's small, dusty chapel, the air thick with the silent disapproval of the assembled townsfolk. Alara stood beside Silas, her head bowed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The tattered wedding dress was still her only attire, a bitter mockery of the vows being spoken. She could feel the stares, the whispers like physical blows. Each word from the weary preacher felt like a nail hammered into the coffin of her former self, of any hope she might have harbored for a future of her own choosing. Silas stood tall and unyielding beside her, a granite pillar in a world of shifting sand. He had washed, she noted, his clothes clean but simple, his presence as stark as the desert itself. His eyes, when they occasionally flickered towards her, held no warmth, no animosity, only a profound, unsettling blankness. He spoke his vows in a low, gravelly voice, devoid of emotion, a mere formality. She mumbled hers, her voice barely a whisper, a ghost of her own choosing. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the chapel, a sound of grim satisfaction. The stain, they believed, had been publicly scrubbed. Outside the chapel, the oppressive silence of the town was broken only by the creak of wagon wheels. Silas had borrowed a sturdy, if aged, wagon. He tossed her meager bundle of belongings, the small, dirted satchel she had carried, into the back with a dull thud. He offered no hand to help her up, no glance of welcome. She climbed in herself, her movements stiff, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She sat on the hard wooden bench, far removed from him, watching the town recede in the rearview mirror, shrinking into a cluster of sun-bleached buildings under the vast, indifferent sky. Their journey was as silent as the land itself. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the gentle thud of the horse's hooves, and the persistent whisper of the wind. Alara stole glances at Silas. He drove with quiet competence, his hands firm on the reins, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He was an enigma, a man defined by his solitude, now bound to her by a decree he clearly resented. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, they turned off the main trail, following a faint, barely visible track through a low, rocky pass. It was here, nestled in a secluded hollow, that she first saw it, Silas's home. It was a small, unassuming cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney, a surprisingly welcoming sight after days of nothing but rock and dust. But the cabin itself was sparse, practical. A stack of neatly chopped firewood sat beside the door, a small garden patch, mostly weeds now, struggling against the arid soil. This was not a home built for two, not a place meant for tenderness or shared life. It was a survival post, a solitary man's fortress against the elements. He pulled the wagon to a halt, the sudden silence deafening. He dismounted, then turned to her, his expression unreadable. There's water in the barrel, a pump for the well. Fires lit. Food scant, but enough. His voice was flat, practical, a list of instructions. He didn't wait for her reply, instead moving to unhitch the horses. Alara slid down from the wagon, her legs stiff. She walked slowly towards the cabin, pushing open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the single room was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of embers in the hearth and a sliver of light from the small window. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot against one wall. That was all. There were no personal touches, no ornaments, nothing to soften the stark utility of the space. Her cot, she realized with a sickening lurch, would be the floor. She swallowed, the familiar taste of despair rising in her throat. She was still trapped, still alone, but now with a silent, imposing guardian who had no desire for her presence. This was not a marriage. It was an unwilling alliance, born of societal decree, a quiet exile in the heart of the wilderness. The first weeks were a silent ballet of awkward proximity. Alara spent her days trying to make herself useful, though her efforts were often clumsy and met with Silas's quiet, unnerving observation. She tried to clean the cabin, stirring up more dust than she settled. She attempted to cook the meager rations of dried beans and salt pork, often burning them or rendering them inedible. Silas never commented, never chastised. He simply ate what she prepared or cooked his own, his movements precise and economical. His silence was a heavy cloak, wrapping around them both, isolating her even within the small confines of the cabin. She missed the sounds of human chatter, even the critical whispers of the town. She missed her mother, the smell of baking bread, the small comforts of a life now irretrievably lost. Tears often pricked her eyes at night as she lay on the thin mattress Silas had provided, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to his even breathing from the cot across the room. But slowly, imperceptibly, a shift began. She watched Silas. She saw the quiet strength in his hands as he repaired a broken fence, the focused intensity in his eyes as he sharpened an axe. She noticed the meticulous care he took with his tools, the way he moved through the land, a part of it not separate from it. He did not speak of the town, of her flight, of their forced union. He simply existed, a stoic force, tackling the endless demands of survival in the unforgiving landscape. And in his quiet competence, Alara found a strange, nascent sense of security. He would not abandon her. He was bound by an unspoken code, a man of his word, even if that word had been forced upon him. One morning, she found him struggling with a stubborn patch of ground, trying to coax a few rows of corn into life. The soil was like rock, baked hard by the relentless sun. Without a word, she picked up a discarded hoe, her hands unaccustomed to its weight, and began to chip away at the earth beside him. Silas paused, his gaze resting on her for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his pale eyes. He said nothing, simply returned to his work. But she felt it, a faint acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance. She learned to mend torn clothes, to patch leaky buckets, to identify the few edible plants that grew in the rocky terrain. Her hands, once soft and useless, began to toughen, calluses forming on her palms. Her back ached, her muscles protested, but with each small success, a tiny ember of pride began to glow within her. She was not merely surviving, she was contributing. One afternoon, a sudden, furious dust storm descended upon them, whipping through the hollow with incredible force. The air turned opaque, visibility dropping to nothing. Alara had been outside, gathering kindling, and was caught unawares. She stumbled, disoriented, the wind tearing at her clothes, stinging her eyes with grit. Panic flared, raw and sharp. Then, a strong hand closed around her arm, pulling her roughly but securely towards the cabin. Silas. He didn't speak, didn't shout over the roaring wind, but his grip was firm, reassuring. He guided her inside, shutting the heavy door just as a particularly violent gust threatened to tear it from its hinges. They stood for a moment in the dim light of the cabin, the sounds of the storm a wild cacophony outside. Alara's heart pounded, but the fear was swiftly replaced by a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at him, her eyes wide, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of concern in his. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by his usual impassivity, but it had been there. A silent acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, a thread of connection woven into the fabric of their unwilling alliance. That night, as the storm raged outside, rattling the very foundations of the cabin, Alara found herself unable to sleep. She lay on her mattress, listening to the wind howl like a banshee, to the groan of the ancient timbers. Silas was asleep on his cot, his breathing deep and even. She watched the flicker of the dying firelight on his face, tracing the lines of hardship and solitude etched there. He was not the monster the town had painted him, nor was he the gallant hero of her childhood fantasies. He was simply Silas, a man forged by this harsh land, a man who had offered a dying woman water and paid a steep price for his kindness. And despite the circumstances of their union, despite the bleakness of their shared existence, a quiet, unfamiliar sense of safety began to bloom within her. It was a fragile, unexpected thing, born not of words or promises, but of silent observation, of shared survival, of the quiet strength she now saw in the man who was, against all odds, her husband. The winter arrived with a brutal, unyielding force, blanketing the land in a thick, suffocating layer of snow. It was a test of endurance, a silent adversary that sought to reclaim all life. Supplies dwindled, and the days were short, dark stretches of biting cold. The cabin, small as it was, became their entire world, forcing a proximity that slowly, irrevocably, broke down the walls between them. Alara, having spent months observing Silas, had learned the rhythms of his life, the unspoken cues, the subtle shifts in his mood. She now knew when he needed a hot cup of tea, when to stoke the fire, when to simply be quiet. She had, in turn, become invaluable. Her nimble fingers mended the heavy furs he trapped, patched their worn clothing, and somehow managed to stretch their meager rations further than he thought possible. She had learned to set snares for rabbits, to identify animal tracks in the snow, her fear of the wilderness replaced by a determined resilience. One afternoon, Silas returned from checking his trap lines, his face pale, a deep gash bleeding freely on his arm. He had slipped on ice, a heavy log falling on him. He entered the cabin, silent as ever, but the grimace of pain he couldn't quite hide spoke volumes. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. She moved instinctively, her hands reaching for the clean strips of cloth she kept for emergencies. She boiled water, cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, her touch surprisingly gentle. Silas watched her, his pale eyes fixed on her face, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. As she bound the wound, careful not to cause him further pain, her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and solid beneath her touch. He did not flinch, did not pull away. The air crackled with an unspoken acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that passed between them, deeper than any words could convey. It was a moment of vulnerability, shared and held in the quiet space of the cabin, warmed by the crackling fire. Days later, the true threat emerged, not from nature, but from the world they had left behind. The snow had lifted slightly, revealing the faint tracks of horses approaching the hollow. Silas, ever vigilant, saw them first from the cabin window. His face hardened. "Vance," he said, his voice a low growl, raw with an emotion Alara had never heard from him before. "And Thomas. They haven't forgotten." The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. They were here for her, perhaps, or for Silas for some imagined crime. They were not merely passing through. They were riding with purpose, their intention clear as the frozen air. There were 5 of them this time, well armed, their faces grim under their hats. They surrounded the cabin, their horses stamping impatiently in the snow. Josiah Vance dismounted, his heavy boots crunching on the packed snow. "Silas Thorne," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the still air. "We know you harbor stolen goods. We've had reports of furs, of supplies, taken from the town. It was a flimsy excuse, a transparent lie. They were here to assert dominance, to punish what they perceived as an affront to their authority. Thomas, the spurned groom, stood beside Vance, his gaze fixed on the cabin, a smirk on his face. "Come out, Thorn, and the woman with you. We'll settle this here and now." Silas moved without hesitation, grabbing his rifle from its pegs. He turned to Alara, his eyes meeting hers. "Stay low," he commanded, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She nodded, her own heart pounding, but strangely, not with fear for herself, but for him. She picked up the old, heavy axe he used for firewood, holding it close, a silent promise to herself that she would not be a burden, that she would fight if she had to. Silas stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands, but his stance was one of unwavering resolve. "You have no business here, Vance," he stated, his voice calm, cutting through the frosty air. Vance scoffed, gesturing with a gloved hand. "We'll be the judge of that. You think you can live out here, taking what you want, defying the rules of decent folk?" As Vance spoke, Thomas moved, attempting to flank Silas, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. But Silas was faster. In a swift, fluid motion, he raised the rifle not to shoot, but to pivot, the barrel catching Thomas sharply across the side of the head. Thomas staggered, clutching his temple, blood blooming on his pale skin. The other men drew their weapons, but Silas had already returned to his defensive stance, the rifle now aimed squarely at Vance's chest. The air crackled with tension, a stalemate. From within the cabin, Alara watched, her breath hitched. This was the moment. Her forced escape, her unwilling marriage, her quiet transformation, all culminating in this standoff. She saw the unwavering resolve in Silas's eyes, the quiet power in his stillness. Vance, taken aback by Silas's sudden, brutal efficiency, hesitated. He looked from the rifle to Thomas, crumpled in the snow, then back to Silas, whose gaze was unyielding. The town elder, a man who relied on bluster and numbers, understood that Silas Thorn was not a man to be trifled with. After a long, tense moment, Vance lowered his hand. "This isn't over, Thorn," he muttered, but the threat lacked conviction. He ordered his men to retrieve Thomas, and they rode away, their departure as grim as their arrival, leaving only tracks in the snow and the echoes of their animosity. Silence descended, deeper and more profound than before. Alara stepped out onto the porch, her hands still gripping the axe. Silas turned to her, his rifle now resting against his shoulder. His pale eyes met hers, and this time, there was no blankness, no distance. There was a quiet intensity, an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had faced, what they had become. He offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of shared victory, of mutual respect. It was more than any words he could have spoken. The sun, having been hidden by clouds for days, broke through, casting long golden rays across the snow-covered landscape. The cabin, once a place of forced confinement, now seemed like a refuge, a sanctuary forged by hardship and shared perseverance. Alara looked out at the vast, wild land, no longer seeing only desolation, but a place of quiet strength, a place where she had found her own. She looked at Silas, the silent, stoic man who was now, truly, her partner. Their marriage, born of coercion and desperation, had been reshaped by the wilderness, by silent understanding, and by the fierce, protective bond forged in the crucible of survival. She was no longer a runaway bride or a cowering victim. She was a woman of the land, scarred but resilient, standing tall beside the man who had, unknowingly, saved her, and whom she, in turn, had come to rely upon. Their future was uncertain, the land still harsh, but they would face it together, two quiet souls carved by the wilderness, finding an unexpected, profound dignity in their shared solitude.